After driving for 6 hours through a blinding blizzard with arthritis burning in every joint, to bring my daughter a $50,000 check to save her home, I walked up to her front door and heard her husband say, "I hope the old man freezes to death in a ditch before he gets here." My daughter laughed and said, "As long as he signs the power of attorney over the lake house first. I do not care if he turns into an ice sculpture." So I did not knock. Instead, I walked back to my truck, picked up my satellite phone, and made a call that would leave them homeless by New Year's before I tell you how I destroyed their lives. Tell me in the comments if you have ever been betrayed by the people you sacrificed everything for. Like and subscribe for more stories of justice. The heater in my 1998 Ford F-150 had died somewhere near Albany, leaving me in a metal icebox on wheels for the last 100 miles. The wipers were fighting a losing battle against the white wall of snow that the weatherman had called the storm of the decade. My knuckles, white and swollen from the arthritis that plagues me every winter, gripped the steering wheel with a desperation that had nothing to do with the slippery roads I am. Harold King, 70 years old, and to the world and my family. I am just a retired warehouse manager living on a fixed income in a drafty cabin in upstate New York. They see my stained flannel shirts, my worn-out work boots, and this rusting truck, and they see a man who has given up. A man who is slowly fading away into poverty and irrelevance. But appearances are a tool. I learned that 40 years ago, when I built King Logistics from a single delivery van into a global empire worth $280 million. I retired 5 years ago, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to know who loved me for me, and who loved me for my bank account. I hid the money, I hid the assets, and I lived a simple life waiting to see the truth. Today was supposed to be the day I broke my silence. In the inside pocket of my heavy wool coat sat a certified check for $50,000. It was not a lot of money to me, but to my daughter, Stephanie, and her husband Brian, it was a lifeline. They had been hinting for months about debt, about the bank threatening foreclosure, about how hard it was to give my granddaughter Lily a proper Christmas. I had decided to play the hero. One last time I had decided to reveal a fraction of my wealth, just enough to save them, to show them that their father was not useless. That drive was a test of my physical endurance. My knees throbbed with a dull ache that shot up my legs every time I pressed the brake. The cold air inside the cab made my breath visible, hanging in front of me like a ghost. I kept glancing at the passenger seat, where a wooden rocking horse sat wrapped in a heavy blanket. I had spent the last 3 months carving it by hand in my workshop, smoothing the walnut wood until it felt like silk, painting the eyes with the same shade of blue as my granddaughter Lily's eyes. It was a gift that money could not buy, a gift of time and love. I remember thinking about Stephanie as the tires crunched over the black ice. She was my only child since my wife Catherine passed away. Stephanie was the only link I had left to the best years of my life. I knew she could be difficult. She was materialistic, focused on appearances, always wanting the newest car or the biggest house in the neighborhood. I had blamed myself for spoiling her when she was young, trying to compensate for the long hours I spent building the company. But I thought beneath the layers of vanity there was still a heart. I thought that when push came to shove, she would choose family over things. I told myself that the distance between us was just geography, not a chasm of values. I told myself that Brian, her husband, was just ambitious, not malicious. I told myself a lot of lies to keep the engine running through that storm. The wind howled, shaking the heavy frame of the truck I could barely see, 10 feet in front of me. I was 70 years old, risking my life on a highway that had been closed to commercial traffic just to be there for Christmas morning, to see Lily's face when she saw the horse, to hand Stephanie the check that would clear her debts. I felt like a king bringing a bounty to his starving subjects. My ego was warm, even if my feet were numb. I imagined the scene clearly. Stephanie crying with relief, Ryan shaking my hand with genuine respect, Lily hugging my leg, calling me the best grandpa in the world. That fantasy was the only fuel I had left when I finally pulled into the long driveway of their colonial-style mansion in Connecticut. It was past 8 in the evening. The house was ablaze with lights golden and welcoming against the blue dark of the storm. It looked like a postcard of the American dream. A wreath hung on every window, and a massive tree sparkled in the foyer, visible through the double-height glass. But as I parked my truck behind Brian's leased Range Rover, the contrast was sickening. My truck looked like a piece of debris that had washed up on a pristine beach, oil dripping onto their manicured pavers, rust eating away at the wheel wells. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the pain in my hips as I stepped down into the snow. I grabbed the wooden horse, protecting it from the snowflakes, and checked my pocket one last time to make sure the check was dry. The walk to the front door was only 50 feet, but it felt like a mile. The wind bit at my exposed face, stinging my eyes. I reached the massive oak front door, my hand raised to knock, but then I stopped. The sound of laughter drifted through the wood. It was loud, raucous laughter, the kind that comes from too much wine and too little conscience. I hesitated. I did not want to interrupt a party. I wanted this to be a family moment. Then I heard Brian's voice, clear and booming, carried by the acoustics of their grand entryway. "I bet the old relic broke down on the highway," Brian said, his voice dripping with a cruel amusement. "That piece of junk he drives is older than our marriage. I honestly hope he went into a ditch. It would save us the embarrassment of having him sit at the table with the Millers tomorrow. Can you imagine him in that moth-eaten sweater trying to talk about the price of firewood while we are trying to close a business deal with the city's top developers? It is social suicide, Stephanie." I stood frozen, my hand hovering inches from the wood. The cold that gripped me then had nothing to do with the blizzard. It was a freeze that started in my marrow. My daughter's voice answered him, and it was a sound that shattered my heart more effectively than any hammer. "Don, not be an idiot, Brian," she snapped. "But not in my defense. We need him here alive, at least for tonight. He has the deed to the cabin in his pocket, or at least the authorization papers. If he freezes to death in a ditch before he signs the transfer of ownership, we have to go through probate. That takes months. We do not have months. The loan sharks gave us until January 1st. If we do not sell that old shack of his and the land it sits on, we lose this house." My hand dropped to my side. The cabin was not just a shack. It was the place where Catherine and I had spent our honeymoon. It was the place where I had planned to live out my days, watching the sun set over the lake. They wanted to sell it. They were not in debt because of bad luck or medical bills. They were in debt to loan sharks, likely because of Brian's gambling habits again, and they planned to strip me of my home to save their vanity project of a mansion. Brian laughed again, the sound of clinking glass accompanying his words. "You are right, honey." Let the old man thaw out, just enough to hold a pen, put some brandy in his hot cocoa, get him sentimental about being a grandfather, and then slide the papers in front of him. He is so desperate for affection. He would sign his own death warrant if you smiled at him while you handed him the pen. Once he signs, we can stick him in the basement on the fold-out cot. The guest rooms are for people who matter. I stood there on the porch, the snow piling up on my shoulders, looking like a snowman abandoned in the yard. Desperate for affection. The words echoed in my head, accusing and accurate. I had driven 6 hours through a blizzard because I was desperate for a scrap of love. I was a lonely old man with hundreds of millions in the bank, but an emotional account that was overdrawn. I looked at the wooden horse in my arms. I had spent hours sanding the rockers, making sure they would not scratch their hardwood floors. I looked at the check in my pocket, the money that was supposed to be a surprise, a savior. Inside, the warmth and the light seemed to mock me. They were drinking my wine, eating food, bought with money. I had sent them last month and planning my eviction from my own life. I realized then that the daughter I loved did not exist. Stephanie was gone, replaced by this predator who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be mined and discarded. And Brian, he was just a parasite, a man who had never done an honest day's work in his life, waiting for the host to die so he could feast. I did not knock. I did not ring the doorbell. I did not scream or cry. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a clarity that I had not felt since my days in the boardroom, when I would execute a hostile takeover of a rival company. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard fury. It was the fury of a man who realizes he has been played. The fury of a father who realizes his sacrifice was a joke. I set the wooden horse down on the porch right in front of the door. The snow began to cover it immediately, burying the blue eyes I had painted so carefully. Let it be a tombstone, I thought. A monument to the grandfather who died tonight. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the check for $50,000. I looked at it for a moment, looking at the zeros that meant so much to them, and so little to me. With stiff, frozen fingers, I tore it in half. Then in half again, I let the pieces fall into the snow, confetti. For a party that would never happen. I turned around and walked back to my truck. The wind was at my back now, pushing me away from the house, pushing me away from the lie. I climbed into the cab, the leather seat freezing against my back. I started the engine, praying it would turn over. It roared to life, a defiant growl in the silent night. I backed out of the driveway, leaving the horse and the torn check behind. I did not look back at the lighted windows. I did not look back at the family I was leaving behind. I drove for 5 miles until I reached the main highway. The heater was still dead, but I did not feel the cold anymore. I felt powerful. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder and reached into the hidden compartment under the passenger seat. It was a false bottom I had installed years ago. Inside was a small fireproof box. I keyed in the code and the lid popped. Open inside sat a black satellite phone and a black titanium American Express Centurion card. The kind of card that has no limit. The kind of card that opens doors that are locked to everyone else. I picked up the phone. It had a direct line to my private office in Manhattan. An office that officially did not exist, an office run by the only person in the world I still trusted, my former executive assistant, and now personal attorney, Mr. Blackwood. It was Christmas Eve, but I knew he would answer. He always answered. The phone rang once. Blackwood, here came the crisp, professional voice. "It is Hal," I said. My voice was raspy, unused. Mr. King. Blackwood's tone shifted instantly from professional to alert. "We did not expect to hear from you. Is everything all right? Did you arrive at your daughter's house?" "I did," I said, looking out at the swirling snow. "I arrived. And I left." "Activate the Omega Protocol, Blackwood." There was a brief silence on the other end. A heavy silence. Blackwood knew what that meant. It meant the test was over. It meant the disguise was coming off. It meant war. "Are you sure, sir?" Blackwood asked quietly. "Once we initiate Omega, there is no going back. The assets will be unfrozen. The blind trusts will be dissolved. Your identity will be public again." "I am sure," I said, watching a snowflake melt on the windshield. "I want you to book the presidential suite at the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Stamford. I want a full staff waiting. I want a tailor there, within the hour. I am done wearing these rags. And Blackwood," "Yes, sir. I want you to buy the debt on my son-in-law's loans. Find out who holds the paper on this house and buy that too. Buy it all. I want to own the air they breathe by tomorrow morning." "Consider it done, sir. The car will meet you at the hotel. Welcome back, Mr. King." I hung up the phone and merged back onto the highway. The old Ford rattled and shook, but I drove it with a new purpose. I was not driving away from my family. I was driving toward my resurrection. Harold, the retired warehouse manager, was dead. He died on that porch, freezing and heartbroken. The man driving the truck was Hal King, the shark of the logistics world, the man who ate competitors for lunch and he was hungry. The drive to Stamford took another hour. By the time I pulled up to the Ritz-Carlton, the blizzard had turned into a whiteout. The hotel was a fortress of limestone and light, a beacon of luxury in the storm. I pulled my rusted, dented truck right up to the front entrance, parking it between a Bentley and a Ferrari. The valet, a young man in a heavy coat, looked at me with horror as I stepped out. My boots were muddy, my coat was covered in snow, and I looked like a homeless man who had taken a wrong turn, sir. "You cannot park here," the valet started to say, stepping forward to wave me away. "This is a private entrance for guests only. You need to move this vehicle immediately." I ignored him. I walked straight toward the revolving glass doors. The doorman stepped in my path, his hand raised, imposing and stern. "Sir, I am going to have to ask you to leave. The shelter is 3 blocks down." I stopped and looked him in the eye. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the black titanium card, holding it up between 2 dirty fingers. The light from the chandelier caught the edge of the card, glinting like a knife blade. "My name is Harold King," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I have a reservation in the presidential suite. And if you do not park my truck and get out of my way, I will buy this hotel and fire you before you can blink." The doorman looked at the card, then at my face. His eyes widened. The color drained from his cheeks. He stepped back, bowing low, practically sweeping the floor with his hat. "My apologies, Mr. King. Welcome to the Ritz-Carlton." "Right this way, sir." I walked into the lobby, the warmth of the hotel hitting me like a physical blow. The scent of expensive perfume and fresh lilies filled the air. I walked across the marble floor, my muddy boots leaving a trail of dirty footprints on the polished stone. People stared. Women in evening gowns clutched their pearls, men in tuxedos sneered. But I did not care. Let them stare. In 24 hours, they would know exactly who I was. I took the elevator to the top floor. The suite was larger than my entire cabin. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the snow-covered city, a fireplace that roared with a gas flame and a bed that looked like a cloud. I stripped off my wet clothes, throwing the flannel shirt and the work pants into the corner. I took a long hot shower, scrubbing the dirt and the grease from my skin, watching the gray water swirl down the drain. I washed away the warehouse manager. I washed away the father. I washed away the victim. When I stepped out of the bathroom, a team was already there, just as Blackwood had promised. A tailor was setting up a mannequin with a midnight blue Italian wool suit. A barber was arranging his razors on the table. A chef was laying out a spread of caviar and Wagyu beef. I stood there wrapped in a plush white robe and looked at my reflection in the mirror. The eyes staring back were tired, yes, but they were sharp. They were the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. I sat in the leather chair while the barber shaved off my scraggly beard, exposing the strong jawline I had hidden for years. He trimmed my hair, styling it back. I stood up and let the tailor dress me. The suit fit like a second skin. The white silk shirt felt cool against my chest. I fastened the platinum cufflinks, heirlooms from my grandfather, and slid my Patek Philippe watch onto my wrist. It had been sitting in a safety deposit box for 5 years, waiting for this moment. I looked in the mirror. The old man was gone. In his place stood Hal King, billionaire, tycoon, predator. I walked over to the desk where Blackwood had set up a secure laptop. The screen was glowing with live feeds from the security cameras I had installed in Stephanie's house 6 months ago. I had told them it was a smart home system, a gift to keep them safe. They never questioned why. The old man gave them such high-tech gadgets. They just liked that it was free now. Those cameras were my eyes and ears inside the enemy camp. I sat down and put on the headphones. On the screen I saw them. Stephanie and Brian were sitting in their living room drinking wine by the fire. The wooden horse was still outside, buried in the snow. "I cannot believe he did not show up," Stephanie was saying, slurring her words slightly. He is so unreliable, I bet he turned around and went home, or he is in a ditch. Brian laughed again, raising his glass. Either way, we have a problem. If he does not sign those papers by tomorrow noon, the Sharks are going to start breaking legs, and mine are the first on the list. Relax, Stephanie said, swirling her wine. He will come, he always comes. He is pathetic like a stray dog. We just have to call him in the morning, cry a little. Tell him we were so worried, play on his guilt. He will drive through hell to get here if he thinks he is saving us. I watched them on the screen, sipping them on my own drink, a 50-year-old scotch that cost more than their car. I watched my daughter plan my manipulation. I watched my son-in-law laugh at my potential death. Make the call, Blackwood, I said to the empty room, knowing my assistant was listening on the other end. Buy the debt, execute the mortgage clauses. I want to own everything they touch by sunrise. It is done, sir. Blackwood's voice came through the speaker. I leaned back in the chair, watching the snow fall outside the window, darker now, more violent. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and I was going to deliver a gift they would never forget. The game had changed, the prey had become the hunter, and the hunt was just beginning. The revolving glass doors of the Ritz-Carlton spun me out of the biting wind and into a lobby that smelled of white tea and old money. My boots, caked with 6 hours of frozen mud, left wet brown streaks on the polished marble floor. The silence that fell over the room was immediate and heavy. Ladies in silk evening gowns stopped, mid-sentence, clutching their pearl necklaces, while men in tuxedos looked at me with open disgust curled on their lips. To them, I was an intruder, a stain on their perfect white evening, a homeless man seeking warmth who had wandered past security. A young security guard stepped forward, his hand reaching for the baton on his belt, his eyes hard and dismissive. Sir, you need to leave immediately, he started, his voice booming in the quiet lobby. This is private property. I did not stop walking. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes fixed on the concierge desk, where a man in an impeccable suit was already sprinting toward me, not with anger, but with a look of sheer terror that I recognized from my days in the boardroom. It was Henri, the general manager, who had started his career as a busboy in one of the hotels I owned 30 years ago. He knew my face. He knew that the man wearing the stained flannel shirt and the torn coat could buy this building and turn it into a parking lot by morning. Mr. King Henri, breathless and pale, intercepted the guard with a sharp wave of his hand. Stand down. Do you not know who this is? The guard froze, confused, looking from the manager to the muddy old man standing before him. Mr. King Henri bowed low, a gesture of respect that sent a ripple of shock through the watching crowd. Welcome back to the Ritz-Carlton. We were alerted by Mr. Blackwood only moments ago. We have prepared the presidential suite exactly as you prefer it. Please forgive the reception. We did not realize you would be arriving in such a ER undercover capacity. I looked at Henri, and for the first time in years, I let the mask slip completely. The gentle grandfather was gone. The tired retiree was gone. I let him see the shark underneath. No need for apologies. Henri, I said, my voice raspy but commanding. Just get me to the room and have the team sent up immediately. I have a lot of work to do and very little time. Right away, sir. Henri snapped his fingers and 3 bellhops appeared seemingly out of thin air, rushing to press the elevator button and hold the doors open for me. I stepped into the elevator and watched the lobby disappear as the doors slid shut. The ascent was smooth, silent, and fast. I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator car. The man staring back at me looked wrecked. His eyes were red-rimmed. His skin was gray from the cold, and his posture was stooped from the arthritis that was still screaming in his joints. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a fire burning, a cold blue flame of resolve. The presidential suite took up the entire top floor. When the doors opened, I stepped onto plush carpet that felt like walking on a cloud. The room was warm, the fireplace already roaring with a gas flame casting dancing shadows on the high ceilings. But I did not stop to admire the view or the architecture. I walked straight to the master bathroom, stripping off the wet coat, the flannel shirt, the thermal undershirt that had failed to keep me warm on that porch, turned the brass knobs of the massive soaking tub, and watched the steam rise, filling the room with a mist that smelled of lavender and eucalyptus. I sank into the scalding water, letting out a long groan as the heat finally penetrated my frozen skin. I watched the dirt from my journey, the grime of the road, and the grease from my old truck swirl away into the water, turning it a murky gray. It was fitting. I thought I was washing away Harold, the weak old man. I was washing away the father who begged for affection. I was washing away the victim. I scrubbed my skin until it was raw, until every trace of the man who had stood on that porch was gone. I stayed in the water until it began to cool, until my mind was as sharp and clear as a diamond. Then I stepped out and wrapped myself in a thick white robe. In the main living area of the suite, the transformation team was waiting. They worked in silence, professional and efficient. A barber motioned me to a chair, and I sat down, leaning my head back. He wrapped a hot towel around my face, softening the scraggly white beard I had grown over the last few years to look the part of the eccentric hermit. When he pulled the towel away, he applied a rich shaving cream and began to work with a straight razor. The blade flashed in the firelight, moving with surgical precision. With every scrape of the razor, I felt lighter. The beard fell away, revealing the strong, square jawline that had once terrified competitors. The barber trimmed my hair, cutting away the unruly locks, styling it back with a pomade that smelled of sandalwood and success. When he spun the chair around to face the mirror, I barely recognized myself. The eyes were the same, but the face was harder, younger, hungrier. Next came the tailor, Vincenzo, an Italian master. I had flown in from New York years ago to keep on retainer. He stood by a mannequin displaying a midnight blue bespoke suit woven from the finest vicuna wool. It was a suit that cost more than Brian's car. I stood and let him dress, stood and saw me. The white dress shirt was crisp and cool against my skin, starched to perfection. The silk tie was a deep crimson, the color of power. The suit jacket slid onto my shoulders like a suit of armor, heavy and protective. Vincenzo stepped back, admiring his work. "You look like the emperor, sir," he murmured. "Not yet," I said. I walked over to the safe in the corner of the room, the one Henri had opened for me upon arrival. Inside, on a velvet cushion, sat a single object. It was not money, it was not a weapon. It was a watch, a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime, a masterpiece of engineering that I had bought the day I sold my first company for 9 figures. It was a symbol of time, mastery, and control. I fastened the leather strap around my wrist, feeling the weight of the gold and the complex mechanics ticking against my pulse. I looked down at it. It was 8 o'clock, the party at Stephanie's house. My house would be starting in 12 hours. I had 12 hours to prepare the stage for their destruction. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling mirror that covered one wall of the suite and looked at the man standing there. The arthritis was still there, a dull throb in my knees, but I stood tall, ignoring the pain. The stained workman was gone. In his place stood Hal King, the titan of industry, the man who could move mountains with a signature, the man who had just decided to burn his own family to the ground, to teach them a lesson. About fire. I adjusted my cuffs, the platinum links catching the light. I ran a hand over the lapel of the suit, feeling the texture of wealth and power. I was no longer the father driving through the snow with a wooden horse. I was the predator who had just caught the scent of blood. "Bring me the phone," I said to the empty room. My voice was steady, devoid of the tremors that had plagued me earlier. Blackwood was waiting on the line. "I am ready," I said, staring at my reflection. "The victim has left the building, the hunter is here, and Blackwood, make sure the helicopter is fueled. I want to make an entrance they will never forget." The laptop screen glowed with a cold blue light in the dim luxury of the presidential suite. Illuminating the glass of scotch in my hand, Blackwood had set up the connection, securely routing the feed through 3 different servers, so my intrusion would remain undetected. I adjusted the noise-canceling headphones over my ears, and the silence of the hotel room was instantly replaced by the ambient sounds of my daughter's living room, the crackle of the fireplace, the clinking of crystal wine glasses, the hum of the refrigerator. It was like being a ghost haunting the house I had paid for. On the screen, Stephanie and Brian were seated on the plush beige sectional sofa. Stephanie was curled up with a glass of red wine staring into the fire, while Brian paced back and forth, his movements jerky and agitated. He looked like a trapped animal. The festive decorations surrounding them, the twinkling tree, the garlands on the mantel, the stockings with their names, embroidered in gold, looked grotesque against the tension radiating from the screen. I leaned forward, watching them, the high-definition camera. I had installed in the smoke detector, captured every bead of sweat on Brian's forehead. It captured the way Stephanie's hand trembled slightly as she brought the glass to her lips. They were not grieving my absence. They were panicking about my delay. Brian stopped pacing and turned to Stephanie, his voice tight with fear, rising an octave. "We are running out of time, Steph. You know what Vinny said. If we do not have the 200 grand by New Year's Day, he is not sending a collection agency. He is sending guys with baseball bats, and they are not coming to play ball. They are coming to break my knees, and after they are done with me, they are going to start looking at this house $200,000. I swirled the scotch in my glass, staring at the man who had married my daughter. He had told me he needed $50,000 to cover some bad investments. In the market, he had lied. He was in deep with loan sharks, gambling debts. Likely, I knew Brian had a weakness for online poker and sports betting, but I had not realized he had gambled away their entire future. And now he expected me to foot the bill, not with cash, but with my home. Stephanie took a long sip of wine, her eyes cold and calculating. "Stop pacing. Brian, you are making me dizzy. The old man is coming. He is just slow. He is probably driving 20 miles an hour on the highway because he is too cheap to replace his windshield wipers. But he will be here, and when he walks through that door, we are going to be the perfect loving family. We are going to feed him roast beef and pour him the good brandy, and then we are going to put the papers in front of him. But what if he does not sign?" Brian asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What if he gets sentimental about that stupid cabin? What if he starts talking about your mother again and how much she loved that porch? You know how he gets. He thinks that rotting pile of wood is a shrine." "It is a shrine," I thought, my grip tightening on the glass. It was where I proposed to Catherine. It was where we spent our summers. It was where she took her last breath, holding my hand as the sun went down over the lake. And they called it a rotting pile of wood. Tiffany laughed, a dry, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. "He will sign," she said with absolute confidence. "Because he is weak. He is lonely, Brian. He spends all day up there talking to himself and carving toys. He is desperate for us to need him. If I tell him that selling the cabin is the only way to save his granddaughter's future, he will sign. He would burn that cabin down himself if I asked him to." I felt a cold rage spreading through my chest, replacing the blood in my veins. She knew exactly which buttons to push. She knew my love for Lily was my greatest weakness, and she was planning to weaponize it to pay off her husband's gambling debts. But Brian was not convinced. He started, pacing again, wringing his hands. "But we need a backup plan, Steph. We cannot rely on his guilt alone. What if he gets stubborn? What if he says he wants to read the contract first? If he reads the fine print, he will see that we are not just selling the cabin. He will see that the power of attorney gives us control over his pension and his savings account." 2. I froze. The power of attorney. It was not just about the real estate. They wanted everything. They wanted to drain me dry, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back. They were not just desperate, they were predatory. Stephanie set her wine glass down on the coffee table with a sharp click. Then we go to Plan B, she said, her voice dropping lower, taking on a sinister edge. What is Plan B? Brian asked, stopping in his tracks. Stephanie reached into her purse, which was sitting on the floor beside the sofa. She pulled out a small orange prescription bottle and shook it. The rattling sound of pills echoed in my headphones. I got these from Dr. Evans, she said, holding the bottle up to the light. Sleeping pills, strong ones, benzodiazepines. If he starts asking too many questions, or if he refuses to sign, we crush 3 or 4 of these into his hot chocolate. He will be out like a light in 20 minutes. And then what? Brian asked, looking at the bottle with a mixture of fear and fascination. And then Stephanie said, shrugging, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. We put the pen in his hand. We guide his signature. It does not have to be perfect. It just has to be close enough. The notary is a friend of yours, right? He will stamp it if we slide him a few $100. By the time the old man wakes up, the deed will be transferred and the money will be wired. He will think he signed it while he was drunk or tired. Who is anyone going to believe? A successful young couple or a senile old man who lives in the woods? I sat back in my leather chair, stunned. The air in the hotel suite felt suddenly thin. It was one thing to be used for money. It was another thing entirely to be drugged and robbed by your own flesh and blood. This was not just greed, this was criminal. This was a conspiracy to commit fraud and assault. My daughter, the little girl I had carried on my shoulders, who I had taught to ride a bike, was planning to poison me to save her lifestyle. Brian stared at the bottle for a long moment. Then a slow grin spread across his face. You are a genius, babe, he said, walking over to kiss her on the forehead. A genius. 3 pills should do it. He is frail. He probably weighs $150 soaking wet. He will not know what hit him, no. I whispered to the empty room, I will not. I watched them for a few minutes longer. They were celebrating now, pouring more wine, toasting to their cleverness and their imminent windfall. They looked so happy, so relieved. They thought they had solved all their problems. They thought they were the hunters setting a trap for a dumb old bear. I took off the headphones and closed the laptop. The silence of the room returned, but the roar in my head was deafening. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the city lights blurred by the falling snow. My reflection stared back at me in the glass. The suit, the watch, the haircut. It was armor, but underneath it, the heart of a father was turning into stone. They wanted a senile old man. I would give them one. They wanted a signature. I would give them one. They wanted a show. I would give them the performance of a lifetime. I picked up the satellite phone again and dialed Blackwood. It is me, I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion that might betray the storm inside me. Go ahead, sir. Add another item to the list, I said, watching the snow swirl against the glass. I want you to contact the chief of police in their district. Tell him I have evidence of a conspiracy to commit fraud and assault. Tell him I want a team on standby tomorrow night. And Blackwood. Yes, sir. Find out who this Vinny character is. Buy Brian's debt from him. Pay him. Whatever he wants. But I want the note. I want to be the one holding the leash when the time comes. Understood, Mr. King. Anything else? Yes, I said, turning away from the window. Get the helicopter ready. I am not driving back there. I am going to descend on them like the wrath of God. I hung up the phone and walked back to the bar. I poured myself another scotch, but I did not drink it. I just held the glass, feeling the cold weight of the crystal. My hand was steady. The arthritis pain was gone, replaced by the adrenaline of the hunt. They thought I was weak. They thought I was alone. They thought I was prey. Tomorrow they would learn that you never corner a king, especially one who built his throne on the bones of those who underestimated him. The game was set, the trap was laid, and I was ready to spring it. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet elegance of the presidential suite like a fire alarm. It was my old flip phone, the chipped plastic brick I kept solely for family. The one that only had 3 numbers saved in its memory. I picked it up from the polished mahogany desk, staring at the caller ID. Stephanie, my daughter. The woman who had just suggested drugging my hot chocolate with tranquilizers less than an hour ago. I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapel of my $5,000 vicuna wool suit, and answered, letting my voice drop into the wavering, raspy timbre of a confused, exhausted old man. "Oh my God, Dad, are you there?" Her voice exploded through the tiny speaker, shrill and vibrating with a panic that would have won her an Academy Award. "We have been calling for hours. Brian is out in the driveway, right now, looking for you with a flashlight. We thought you slid off the road. We thought you were dead." The performance was breathtaking, truly. If I had not just watched her sipping expensive red wine and plotting my financial ruin 10 minutes ago, I might have believed her. I might have felt guilty for making her worry. But now all I heard was the desperation of a predator who realized her prey had wandered off the trail. "I'm here, Stephanie," I said, keeping my sentences short, portraying the physical exhaustion. She expected, "I'm all right." The truck. It just gave up on me. About 20 miles back, the alternator. I think it is dead cold. Stone dead, just like this weather. I coughed into the receiver, a dry rattle that I had perfected over the last few years. Whenever I wanted to avoid a social engagement, I waited for her to offer to come pick me up, to send a tow truck, or an Uber to do what a daughter should do. But there was a beat of silence, a microsecond of calculation, before she spoke again. "Oh no. That is terrible, but you are safe, right? You are somewhere warm." She was checking the condition of the asset, not the safety of her father. "I am at a Motel 6 off the interstate," I told her, lying with the ease of a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers in his sleep. "I got the last room. It smells like stale smoke and the heater rattles. But it is a roof over my head. We'll try to fix the truck in the morning when the storm breaks. You have to get here tomorrow, Dad." Her voice sharpened, losing a fraction of its weepiness and gaining a jagged edge of urgency. "You simply have to. It is Christmas. We have the turkey. The neighbors are coming. Everyone is dying to see you, and we have surprises for you. We cannot have Christmas without Grandpa. Please promise me you will try to start that truck first thing in the morning." Surprises. She meant the contract. She meant the pen she was going to force into my hand. She meant the pills waiting in her purse. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the soft leather of the chair, feeling the weight of the Patek Philippe watch on my wrist. "I promise." "Sweetheart," I said, injecting a tremor into my voice. "I will be there by noon. I would not miss it for the world. I love you, Steffi. I love you both. We love you too, Daddy. Get some rest. Stay warm. Do not spend money on breakfast. Just get here." She hung up. The click was final and cold. I stared at the cheap plastic phone in my hand, knowing that on the other end, she was probably high-fiving. Her husband, relieved that the old fool was still on the hook. She thought I was shivering under a thin motel blanket, counting my pennies, worrying about the repair bill. She had no idea I was sitting in the lap of luxury, counting the hours until her destruction. I set the phone down next to my empty glass of scotch. The test was over. I knew exactly where I stood. Now it was time to show them where they stood. The grandfather clock in the corner of the suite chimed 12 times, echoing through the silent room like a judge's gavel. Midnight. The witching hour, the time when carriages turn back into pumpkins and dreams turn into nightmares. For my daughter and her husband. The nightmare was just beginning. They just did not know it yet. A soft knock at the heavy oak door broke the silence. It was not the hesitant tap of room service. It was the firm, authoritative knock of a man who knows he is expected. "Come in," I said, without turning away from the window where the city lights were now just blurry smudges against the relentless snow. The door opened, and Mr. Blackwood stepped in. He brought with him the scent of cold air and expensive leather. He was carrying a thick black briefcase, the kind that usually contains state secrets or the ruins of a corporation. He did not smile. He did not offer pleasantries. He simply walked to the mahogany desk, placed the briefcase down, and clicked the latches open. The sound was sharp, a metallic snap that felt like a trap springing shut. "Have it all, sir," Blackwood said, his voice low and gravelly. He began to lay out the files on the desk, organizing them with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an amputation. There were 2 stacks. One red, one blue. The red stack represents Mr. Davis' gambling debts. I made contact with the individual known as Vinny an hour ago. He was initially reluctant to sell the paper, preferring his usual methods of collection, but when I offered him 100 cents on the dollar in cash, he became very cooperative. You now own Brian Davis' debt in its entirety. $212,000, including the VIG. I walked over to the desk and ran my hand over the red file. It felt hot to the touch, as if the desperation and fear Brian must have felt when he signed these promissory notes were still radiating from the paper. I opened it. Inside were copies of IOUs, text messages, threatening violence, and a ledger of missed payments. Brian had not just borrowed money, he had dug a hole so deep he could see hell from the bottom. "And the house?" I asked, looking at the blue stack. Blackwood nodded, tapping the blue file with a manicured finger. "The mortgage on the property at 45 Lakeview Drive. It was held by a mid-tier bank that was all too happy to offload a distressed asset. They have missed their last 3 payments, sir. The foreclosure notice was scheduled to go out on Monday morning. We intercepted it. I purchased the note. I purchased through the shell company, Omega Holdings. As of 20 minutes ago, you are the lien holder. You are the bank." I sat down in the leather chair, picking up the heavy fountain pen Blackwood had placed next to the documents. It was a Mont Blanc, weighted and cold. I looked at the papers. The transfer of debt, the assignment of mortgage, the legal instruments that transferred the power of life and death from a violent loan shark and a faceless bank directly into the hands of a father who had been pushed too far. It was a strange feeling, holding the financial existence of my own children in my hands. For years I had protected them. I had paid for college cars, weddings, always from the shadows, always letting them believe they were lucky, or that things just worked out. Now I was stepping out of the shadows, not as a savior, but as a creditor. "If I sign these," I said, looking up at Blackwood, "I own them completely." Blackwood replied, "You can call the loan due at any time. You can foreclose on the house at any time. You control the timeline. You control the terms. Effectively, sir, you own the air they breathe." I looked at the signature line. It was just a line of black ink on white paper, but it represented the end of their freedom. It represented the consequences they had spent their entire adult lives avoiding. They wanted to sell my cabin to pay this debt. They wanted to drug me to pay this debt. They were willing to kill the memory of their mother to get out from under this weight. They did not realize that the weight was not going away. It was just changing hands. Uncapped the pen, the ink was black, dark as the night outside. I signed my name, Harold King, not the shaky scrawl of the old man they thought I was, but the sweeping, aggressive signature of the CEO who had built an empire. I signed the purchase agreement for the debt. I signed the transfer of the mortgage. With every stroke of the pen, I felt the chains tightening around them. "They think they are fighting for survival tomorrow," I said, closing the files and handing them back to Blackwood. "They think if they get my signature, they win. They have no idea the game was over before they even poured the first glass of wine." Blackwood placed the files back into his briefcase, locking it with a satisfying click. "What are your instructions regarding the collection, sir?" "Hold it," I said, standing up and walking back to the window. Hold it. Until the party. Tomorrow night, when their house is full of their fancy friends, when they think they have won, when they are drinking champagne and celebrating their victory over the senile old man, that is when we present the bill, I want the sheriff there. Blackwood, I want the eviction notice prepared, and I want you to walk through that door like the Grim Reaper. Consider it done, Blackwood said. He picked up the briefcase and turned to leave. But at the door he paused, looking back at me with a rare expression of softness. Sir, if I may. Go ahead, your wife, Catherine. She would be proud of you, not for the revenge, but for the lesson. You are saving them from themselves. Even if it feels like you are destroying them, I looked at my reflection in the glass. The hard eyes, the set jaw. I hope so, Blackwood, I said quietly. I hope so, 'cause right now it feels like I am about to burn down my own house to kill the rats. Blackwood nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving me alone in the silence. The deed was done. I was no longer just a father. I was the bank. I was the law. And tomorrow payment was due in full. The sun rose over Stamford, crisp and blindingly bright, bouncing off the fresh snow like diamonds spread across a white sheet. It was Christmas morning, the day of miracles and family gatherings, the day when peace on earth was supposed to reign supreme. But as I stood in the center of the presidential suite staring at the pile of old clothes on the floor, I felt no peace. I felt only the cold steel of resolve hardening in my gut. I stripped off the silk pajamas the hotel provided and reached for the stained flannel shirt and the worn canvas work pants I had discarded the night before. They smelled of old grease and stale sweat. The scent of the man my daughter thought I was putting them back on felt like stepping into a prison uniform, but it was necessary. The Patek Philippe watch went back into the safe. The handmade Italian leather shoes were swapped for my scuffed, salt-stained boots. I looked in the mirror one last time. The billionaire was gone. The tired, broke warehouse manager stared back, his shoulders slumped, his eyes dim. It was the greatest acting performance of my life, and the curtain was about to rise. I took the elevator down to the garage, avoiding the lobby and the stairs. I climbed back into the freezing cab of the 1998 Ford F-150. The engine groaned in protest, coughing and sputtering before finally catching with a rough idle that shook the entire frame. I drove out of the Ritz-Carlton, leaving the warmth and the safety behind, heading back toward the Lion's Den. The drive back to the suburbs was slow, the roads still slick with ice. Every mile closer to that house felt like a mile closer to a cliff edge, but this time I wasn't the one who was going to fall. When I pulled into the long, winding driveway of Stephanie's home, the scene was picture perfect. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The snow on the roof was untouched and pristine. It looked like the kind of home where love lived, where memories were cherished. But I knew better as I brought the truck to a halt behind Brian's Range Rover. My eyes were drawn immediately to the front porch. There, sitting exactly where I had left it the night before, was the wooden rocking horse. It was almost completely buried now, just the tip of one walnut ear poking out through the drift. They hadn't even bothered to bring it inside. They hadn't cared enough to check what I had left. They had stepped over my labor of love to get back to their wine and their plotting. That mound of snow was the final nail in the coffin of my mercy. I opened the truck door and stepped out deliberately, letting my leg buckle slightly, feigning a weakness I did not feel. I grabbed my old battered coat, wrapping it tight around me. Hunching my shoulders against the wind, I hadn't even taken 2 steps toward the house when the front door flew open. And oh, thank God, it was Stephanie. She ran out onto the porch wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She wasn't wearing a coat. She was playing the part of the frantic daughter, too worried to grab a jacket. She rushed down the steps, her arms wide open, her face twisted into a mask of relief and concern, but I watched her eyes. They didn't look at my face. They didn't search mine for signs of frostbite or pain. They darted instantly to my chest pocket, to the place where a deed or a check would be kept. It was a microsecond of truth before the performance took over. She threw her arms around me, hugging me tight. The scent of her expensive vanilla perfume was suffocating. Choking me, I stood stiffly in her embrace, feeling the coldness of it. It wasn't a hug of affection. It was a pat down. She was checking for bulk, she was feeling for the outline of papers. I let my head drop onto her shoulder, playing the exhausted old man while my heart beat a slow, steady rhythm of rage. "I was so worried, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a fake sob. "We didn't sleep all night waiting for you. Why didn't you call us back? We thought you froze to death in that horrible motel." I patted her back, my hand clumsy in my thick glove. "I am here, Steffi," I rasped, letting a wheeze creep into my voice. "The truck. It is a stubborn old mule just like me. But I made it. It is Christmas," I promised. Brian appeared in the doorway, then leaning casually against the frame, holding a steaming mug of coffee. He was wearing a festive sweater, looking every inch the suburban dad, carefree and prosperous. He watched Stephanie hug me with a tight smirk, a look of satisfaction that made my knuckles itch to connect with his jaw. He didn't run down the steps. He strolled down, taking his time, sipping his coffee like a man surveying his property. "Glad you made it, Hal," he said, his voice booming and jovial, a little too loud. "We were taking bets on whether that truck would survive the trip. Come on, let's get you inside. You look like a popsicle." He reached out and clapped a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, too firm. It was a possessive grip, the way a butcher handles a side of beef, examining the quality of the meat. His eyes, like Stephanie's, dropped immediately to my pockets, scanning the bulge of my wallet, scanning the inside of my coat, looking for the salvation he was so desperate for. "Did you bring everything?" Hal Brian asked, dropping his voice slightly, pretending to be helpful, keeping his tone light. "We wouldn't want you to have made the trip for nothing. You know, with the weather and all." I looked up at him, squinting against the glare of the sun, letting my mouth hang open, slightly in a look of senile confusion. "I brought myself, Brian," I said, my voice trembling. "I brought my appetite. Is that enough?" Brian's smile faltered for a second, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he smoothed it back over. "Of course, Hal. Of course, that is the most important thing, but you know we have some business to discuss later, right? To keep you safe, I repeated, testing the word on my tongue. "Yes, safe. That is all I want." "Come on inside, Dad," Stephanie said, pulling away from me and guiding me toward the door, her grip on my arm tight and controlling. "You're freezing. Let's get you some hot cocoa and get you warmed up by the fire. We have such a big day planned. The Millers are coming tonight and we want you to be rested." I let them lead me up the stairs, walking past the snow-covered rocking horse. Without a word, I let them guide me into the warmth of their home, into the trap they had set. I walked across the threshold, shuffling my boots on the mat, playing the part perfectly. They thought they were welcoming a helpless old man into their web. They didn't realize they had just invited the demolition crew inside. And as the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in, I allowed myself a small, hidden smile. The wolf was in the fold, and the sheep were none the wiser. The warmth of the house was suffocating, a dry, artificial heat that smelled of pine needles and desperation. Stephanie led me to the beige sectional in the living room, patting the cushion as if calling a dog. "Sit here, Dad. Rest those bones. I will get you that cocoa." I sank onto the sofa, letting out a long, exaggerated groan, rubbing my knees. The room was exactly as I had seen it on the surveillance feed. Pristine, decorated to within an inch of its life. A showroom, not a home. But now, being physically inside it, the air felt heavy, charged with the silent electricity of their hidden agenda. Brian hovered near the fireplace, poking at the logs with an iron poker, his back to me, but I could see his reflection in the mirror above the mantel. His eyes were not on the fire. They were on me, watching, waiting. "I need to use the facilities," I announced, pushing myself up with a grunt. My bladder is not what it used to be. The cold, you know. Of course, Hal, Brian said, turning around too quickly, his smile tight, just down the hall. First door on the left, take your time. I nodded, shuffling toward the hallway. But as I passed the entryway console, I paused, shrugging off my heavy old coat. Let me just leave this here, I mumbled. It is dripping all over your nice floors. I hung the coat on the rack, the fabric heavy and wet, smelling of damp wool and exhaust. I made sure the inside pocket gaped open just slightly, revealing the edge of a worn leather wallet. I walked down the hall, my footsteps heavy and slow. When I reached the bathroom, I went inside and closed the door, but I did not lock it. I left it cracked, just a fraction of an inch, enough to hear enough to see a sliver of the hallway. I turned on the faucet, letting the water run loud and steady, creating a cover of noise. Then I pressed my eye to the crack and waited. It took less than 10 seconds. Brian moved with the speed of a striking cobra. He was at the coat rack in 3 silent strides. He looked toward the kitchen where Stephanie was making noise with mugs and spoons, then toward the bathroom door, assured by the sound of running water. He reached into my coat pocket, his hand diving in like a thief in the night. He pulled out the wallet, flipping it open with practiced ease. I could see the anticipation on his face, the hunger. He was looking for the platinum cards he remembered from the old days, the cash I used to carry in thick wads, but his face fell almost instantly. He rifled through the billfold, his fingers digging frantically into the empty slots. There was nothing inside but a few expired coupons, a library card, and a single $5 bill. Nothing, he hissed under his breath, a sound so faint I almost missed it over the rushing water. He shook the wallet upside down, as if expecting $100 bills to fall out, like confetti. Nothing fell but a bit of pocket lint. He shoved the wallet back into the pocket, his movements rough and angry. Then he did something that made my blood boil, something so petty and vile it revealed the true depth of his character. He leaned in close to my coat, gathered a glob of saliva in his mouth, and spat right onto the collar of my flannel shirt. He rubbed it in with his thumb, grinding his disdain into the fabric, wiping his hand on his expensive jeans with a look of pure revulsion. "Old broke bastard," he whispered, his face twisted into a sneer. "You are useless, absolutely useless." I watched him from the shadows of the bathroom, my hand gripping the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. He did not just want my money, he hated me. He hated my presence, he hated my history, he hated that he needed me. That spit was his true feelings, manifest. He turned and walked back into the living room, composing his face into a mask of geniality. Before he sat down again, I waited a beat, then flushed the toilet and turned off the tap. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The anger was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but I forced a smile onto my face, a vacuous, senile smile. I splashed some water on my cheeks to look refreshed or perhaps teary-eyed. When I walked back out, Brian was sitting by the fire sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Stephanie came out of the kitchen carrying a tray with 3 mugs of hot chocolate topped with marshmallows. "Here we go, Dad," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "just how you like it." I took the mug, my hands trembling slightly, feigning weakness. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. I walked over to my coat, pretending to check the pockets, making a show of patting them down, as if looking for something. Brian watched me, his eyes narrowing. "Everything all right, Hal?" he asked, his voice laced with false concern. "Just checking for my reading glasses," I muttered, pulling the wallet out. Slightly, then pushing it back in, I thought I lost them. "They must be in the truck." "Good," Brian said, relaxing. "We would not want you to lose anything important today." I looked at him, seeing the ghost of his spit on my collar, knowing the contempt that lay beneath his smile. I sat down and took a sip of the cocoa. It was sweet, cloying, but it tasted like victory because I knew something they did not. The wallet was empty because my money was not in it. My money was a weapon, and I had already fired the first shot. The dining room was a theater of cruelty, dressed up in silk napkins and fine bone china. Stephanie had set the table with the good silver, the set. Catherine and I had given them as a wedding present 10 years ago. The heavy forks and knives gleamed under the crystal chandelier, catching the light of the tall, tapered candles. It was a setting fit for royalty, a scene that screamed prosperity and class. But as I sat there, my knees knocking against the table leg because they had placed me at the smallest wobbly chair in the corner, I knew this wasn't a celebration. It was a negotiation disguised as a meal. Brian walked in from the kitchen, carrying a massive platter that smelled of heaven. It was a standing rib roast crusted with rosemary and garlic, the fat rendering perfectly down the sides, steam rising in thick, savory clouds. My stomach gave a treacherous growl. I hadn't eaten anything since the hors d'oeuvres at the Ritz the night before, and the smell of the meat was almost intoxicating. Brian set the platter down in the center of the table with a grunt of satisfaction, picking up the carving knife and sharpening it against the steel with a rhythmic scraping sound that felt like a blade being readied for a sacrifice. He began to carve, slicing thick, juicy slabs of pink meat, placing them onto Stephanie's plate, then his own. He piled on the roasted potatoes, the glazed carrots, the Yorkshire pudding. It was a feast, a display of excess intended to show their wealth to the neighbors who would be arriving later. I watched him waiting for my share. My hands were folded in my lap, my posture stooped, waiting like a beggar at a banquet. Brian lifted a slice of beef, the juice dripping from it, and moved it toward my plate. "No, Brian," Stephanie's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. She reached out and put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Don't give him that," Brian paused, the meat hovering mid-air. "Why not?" "It's Christmas." "Steph, let the old man eat." Stephanie looked at me with a pitying smile, the kind you give to a child who doesn't understand why they can't touch the stove. "Oh, Daddy, you know you can't handle rich food like this anymore. Remember last Thanksgiving? You got such terrible heartburn." "We don't want you getting sick tonight, not with the Millers coming over. We need you in top form to sign those papers." She stood up and walked to the kitchen, returning a moment later with a small, chipped bowl. It wasn't china, it was a plastic microwave-safe bowl, the kind used for leftovers. Inside was a pale, lukewarm liquid, with a few sad floating islands of vegetable. It was canned vegetable soup, and by the smell of it, it had been opened days ago. "Here you go," she said, placing the bowl in front of me instead of the roast. "It's low sodium, easy on the digestion. We are just thinking of your health, Dad. We want you around for a long time." I looked at the gray soup, then at the prime rib on their plates. The insult was so precise, so calculated. It wasn't about health, it was about dominance, it was about stripping away my dignity, reminding me that in this house I was a dependent, a burden, someone to be managed, not honored. I picked up my spoon, my hand trembling slightly, not from age but from the sheer effort of not flipping the table over. "Thank you, Steffi," I mumbled, dipping the spoon into the broth. It tasted like metallic water. "You are always so thoughtful." Brian shrugged and dropped the slice of meat onto his own plate, adding it to his mountain of food. "Suit yourself," he said, stuffing a forkful of potato into his mouth. "Let's dig in." As they ate, the real performance began. Stephanie took a sip of wine and let out a long, heavy sigh, rubbing her temples as if she carried the weight of the world. "This roast is delicious." "Brian," she said, her voice taking on a tragic tone, "it is a shame it might be the last one we can afford. The price of heating oil has gone up again. And the mortgage rates, it is just getting so hard to keep our heads above water." Brian nodded, chewing with his mouth open, putting on a show of stress. "We are working so hard. Hal, I am pulling double shifts showing houses on weekends trying to make ends meet, but this market, it is killing us. We might have to let the landscaper go. We might even have to sell the Range Rover." I sipped my soup, forcing the tasteless liquid down, listening to their lies. They weren't broke because of the market. They were broke because they spent money like water and gambled the rest away. But I played my part. I widened my eyes. Looking concerned, is it that bad? I asked my pension check. It isn't much, but... Stephanie reached across the table and patted my hand. Her fingers cold. Your pension is sweet. Dad. But it barely covers your groceries. We are talking about real debt, real problems. We are worried about the future, about your future, my future, I repeated. Yes, Brian chimed in, waving his fork. You are out there in that cabin, all alone. It is dangerous, Hal. What if you slip on the ice? What if the power goes out? You are sitting on a gold mine out there, but you are living like a pauper. It doesn't make sense. Stephanie leaned in, her eyes locking onto mine. Dad, we found this amazing place for you. It is a senior community down in Florida, sunshine every day, bingo nights, nurses on call 24/7. You would never have to lift a shovel again. You could just relax in the cabin. I asked, keeping my voice neutral. We would handle that for you, Stephanie said quickly, too quickly. We would sell it, invest the money for your care. It is prime real estate. Dad, developers are dying for that land. We could get a great price, enough to pay for the best facility in Florida and have enough left over to secure Lily's college fund. You want to help Lily, don't you? There it was, the hook, the guilt, the leverage. They were eating a $300 roast beef in front of a man they were feeding, slop, asking him to sell his home so they could pay off their debts, all under the guise of charity. I looked at the soup, swirling the spoon. It is a lot to think about, I said softly. The cabin, it has memories. Memories don't pay the bills, Hal Bryan said, his voice hardening slightly. Look, we are just trying to help you. You are drowning out there and you don't even know it. Let us save you. I looked up at them, at the grease shining on Brian's chin, at the calculation in Stephanie's eyes. They didn't want to save me. They wanted to consume me. But as I scraped the bottom of the plastic bowl, I realized something. They were the ones drowning. They were the ones starving for something they couldn't get. And I was the only one at the table who knew that the check had already been paid, and the bill was coming due. You are right, I said, putting the spoon down. I am getting too old for this struggle. Maybe it is time for a change. Stephanie and Brian exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated greed. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was broken. They didn't know. I was just clearing the table for the main course. Brian cleared the plates with a speed that suggested the main event was finally about to begin. The roast beef bones were whisked away, the gravy boat vanished, and the heavy oak table was wiped down with a linen cloth, leaving a vast, empty expanse of wood. Stephanie poured me a glass of brandy, her hand hovering near my shoulder, a touch that felt more like a restraint than a caress. Drink up, Dad, she purred. It will help settle your stomach. I lifted the snifter, inhaling the fumes. It was cheap brandy, the kind that burns the throat. Not the smooth cognac they were sipping. But I took a small sip, coughing theatrically, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand to really sell the image of the unrefined old man. Brian returned from his study, carrying a thick leather folder. He placed it on the table with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the sudden silence of the room. He didn't sit down. He stood over me, looming his shadow, falling across my face, blocking out the light from the chandelier. He opened the folder, revealing a stack of crisp legal documents bordered in blue, densely packed with text. Okay? Hal, Brian said, his voice brisk and businesslike, stripped of the fake joviality from before. We need to get the ball rolling if we want to get you into that facility by next month. These spots fill up fast. We called in a favor to hold a room for you, but we need to finalize the paperwork tonight. He slid the stack toward me, handing me a heavy gold pen. It felt cold and slick in my hand. What is all this? I asked, squinting at the papers, pushing my reading glasses down my nose, feigning difficulty focusing. It looks like a book. It is just standard intake forms, Stephanie said, quickly pulling up a chair beside me, too close, invading my personal space. It is the insurance application, Dad, and the medical release forms. You know how bureaucrats are. They need 10 signatures just to give you an aspirin. Just sign at the tabs I marked. I looked down at the page. The text was small, but my vision was perfect. I wasn't looking at insurance forms. The header at the top of the first document read, "Durable Power of Attorney." Beneath that, in bold letters, "Irrevocable Transfer of Assets and Quitclaim Deed." They weren't just signing me up for a nursing home, they were stripping me of my legal identity. They were authorizing themselves to sell my property, access my bank accounts, and make medical decisions on my behalf, including end-of-life care. They were asking me to sign my own death warrant. "I can't read this small print," I mumbled, pushing the papers away slightly. "It makes my head swim. Can we do this in the morning?" "My eyes are tired." "No!" Stephanie snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. She caught herself instantly, taking a deep breath and forcing that sickly sweet smile back onto her face. "I mean, we really should do it now, Dad. The courier is coming first thing in the morning. We don't want you to lose your spot, do we?" "Do it for Lily." She wants her grandpa to be safe and happy for Lily, the magic words. They used my granddaughter like a battering ram, smashing through my defenses. I looked at Stephanie, at the desperate greed shining in her eyes. She was practically vibrating with tension. Her fingers were drumming on the table, tap, 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 a countdown to her payday. I picked up the pen again, letting my hand shake violently. The tip of the pen danced over the paper, making ink blotches. I looked up at Brian. He was sweating despite the cold outside, droplets beating on his upper lip. He was watching the pen tip with the intensity of an addict watching a needle. "Where do I sign?" I asked, my voice weak and defeated. "Right here," Brian said, pointing a thick finger at the signature line on the power of attorney document. And here, just your name, Hal." "Just like you always do." Leaned over the paper, hunched and frail. I pressed the pen to the page. Feeling the resistance, I started to write Harold. The letters were shaky, jagged. I paused after the first name, letting out a long, wheezing breath, as if the effort was exhausting me. "Keep going, Dad," Stephanie urged, whispering in my ear, almost hissing. "You are doing great." "Almost there." I finished the signature. King, but I didn't sign it the way I had signed checks for 40 years. I didn't sign it the way it appeared on my driver's license or my passport. My legal signature was a sharp, angular scrawl, distinctive and consistent. For this, however, I added a small loop to the K and missed the dot on the I in my middle name completely. It was subtle enough that they wouldn't notice in their excitement, but distinct enough that any forensic handwriting analyst would flag it immediately. Combined with the fact that the assets they were trying to steal had already been moved to a blind trust 24 hours ago, this document was worth less than the napkin I had used to wipe my mouth. I signed the deed to the cabin. I signed the transfer of my savings account. I signed the medical proxy. With every signature, I felt a piece of the man. I used to be dying. Replaced by something colder, something harder. I was giving them the rope and they were eagerly tying the noose around their own necks. "There," I said, dropping the pen onto the table. It rolled away, leaving a small ink stain on the tablecloth. I rubbed my wrist, acting as if the exertion had pained me. "Is that it?" "Are we done?" Brian snatched the papers up before the ink was even dry. He flipped through them, checking every signature, his eyes darting back and forth. He let out a breath he must have been holding for hours, a long, shuddering exhale of triumph. He looked at Stephanie and nodded, a grin splitting his face that was terrifying in its naked avarice. "We got it," he mouthed to her. Stephanie sagged in her chair, closing her eyes for a second. A look of pure rapture on her face. They had done it. They had tricked the old man. They had secured the bag. The loan sharks would be paid, the house would be saved, and they would be rich. Then the change happened. It was instant, brutal, and absolute. The moment the papers were secured in Brian's folder, the warmth evaporated from the room. Stephanie stood up, smoothing her skirt, and looked down at me, not with love, Not even with pity, but with the annoyance one feels for a piece of trash that has missed the bin. Good, she said, her voice flat, cold, hard. You should get some sleep, now. I looked up at her, blinking, expecting perhaps a thank you, a hug, a moment of shared relief, but there was nothing. The transaction was complete, and I was no longer a customer. I was inventory. Where do I sleep? I asked, looking toward the stairs, assuming I would be in the guest room, the one with the view of the lake. Stephanie laughed, a short barking sound. Not upstairs, Dad. The guest rooms are being prepped for the party tonight. The Millers are staying over, and we need the space. Brian walked over to the hallway door and opened it, gesturing with his head downstairs. Hal, we set up the cot in the basement. It is quiet down there. You won't be disturbed by the music. And honestly, you smell like wet dog and old flannel. We can't have you mingling with the guests looking like that. The basement. The unfinished damp concrete box where they stored their holiday decorations, and the broken exercise equipment they never used. They were putting me in the cellar like a shameful secret, hiding me away while they celebrated with my money. But it is Christmas, I said, letting a note of genuine hurt seep into my voice. I thought we were spending the evening together. We spent the evening together, Stephanie said, turning her back on me, walking toward the kitchen to pour herself more wine. We had dinner. You signed the papers, and now we have adult things to do. Just go downstairs, Dad. Don't make a scene. You are lucky we are letting you stay here at all, considering how much of a burden you are going to be until that facility takes you. Brian walked over and grabbed my arm, his grip bruising, pulling me up from the chair. Come on, old-timer, let's go. March time. He dragged me toward the basement door, and I stumbled, my boots catching on the rug, but he didn't slow down. He shoved me through the doorway onto the landing at the top of the wooden stairs. The air coming up from below was musty and cold, smelling of mildew and neglect. There is a bathroom in the corner down there, Brian said, standing in the light of the hallway, his silhouette looming over me. Don't come up until we come get you in the morning, and keep the noise down. We don't want to hear you coughing all night. He reached for the door handle, his eyes cold, devoid of any spark of humanity. Merry Christmas, Hal, he said with a sneer. Then he slammed the door shut, plunging me into darkness. I heard the lock click, the deadbolt sliding home, sealing me in. They had locked me in the basement. They had taken everything they thought I had, and then they had discarded me like a wrapper. I stood in the dark at the top of the stairs, listening to their footsteps, retreating, listening to their laughter bubbling up again, muted by the door. They were celebrating. They were high on their victory, calling Vinny the loan shark, probably opening the expensive champagne. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, high-tech flashlight Blackwood had given me. I clicked it on the beam, cutting through the gloom. I walked down the creaky stairs into the belly of the house. In the corner there was a folding cot with a thin blanket and a bucket, presumably for my waste. It was a cell, a prison for the unwanted. I sat down on the cot, the springs groaning under my weight. I turned off the flashlight, sitting in the absolute dark, letting the cold seep into my bones. But I didn't shiver. I wasn't cold. I was burning. They thought I was trapped. They thought I was finished. They didn't know that I wasn't locked in there with them. They were locked in there with me. And the key was in my pocket, waiting for the right moment to turn. I checked my watch. The luminous dial of the Patek Philippe glowing in the dark, 7 p.m. The party started at 8. The guests would be arriving soon. The elite of Connecticut, the people, Stephanie and Brian, were so desperate to impress. I laid back on the cot, crossing my hands behind my head, and waited. Let them drink, let them laugh, let them think they are kings of the world. Because in a few hours, the real king was coming upstairs, and he was bringing hell with him. The heavy deadbolt of the basement door slid back with a metallic screech that cut through the darkness of my confinement. The door swung open, flooding the landing with golden light and the deafening roar of a party in full swing. Jazz music, laughter, the clinking of crystal, and the hum of dozens of conversations washed over me. I stood up from the cot, blinking against the sudden brightness. My joints stiff from the cold, damp air protested as I climbed the wooden stairs. Brian stood at the top, silhouetted against the light, holding a tumbler of amber liquid that swayed dangerously in his hand. He was already drunk, his face flushed and his tie loosened. "It is showtime, Hal," he slurred, leaning against the doorframe. "We need a prop for the sympathy act. Come on up. But do not touch the hors d'oeuvres, and for God's sake, try not to drool on the guests." I shuffled past him, keeping my head down, playing the broken man. He grabbed my shoulder, his fingers digging into the worn wool of my coat, steering me into the living room. The transformation was staggering. The furniture had been pushed back to create a dance floor. A string quartet was playing in the corner. Waiters in white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and arrogance. The room fell silent as we entered. The guests, the elite of Connecticut, the people Stephanie and Brian were drowning in debt to impress, turned to stare. They saw a young, vibrant couple guiding a dirty, disheveled old man into the room, like a charity case. Stephanie appeared at my side, her face arranged into a mask of tragic bravery. She was wearing a red silk gown that hugged every curve, diamonds glittering at her throat and ears, diamonds bought with credit cards that were maxed out. Everyone, she announced, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "This is my father, Harold. He made it through the storm to be with us tonight, despite his confusion. We are just so blessed to have him here, even if he does not quite know where here is." A collective murmur of pity rippled through the crowd. "You are a saint, Stephanie," a woman in a sequined dress whispered loudly, touching Stephanie's arm. "To take him in like this, it is so noble." Stephanie squeezed my arm hard enough to bruise. "It is a labor of love," she sighed, looking at me with eyes that promised retribution. "If I spoke, we are just trying to make his last Christmas in his own home special before the transition." They led me to a small velvet stool in the corner, away from the buffet, away from the warmth of the fire. It was the spot you would put a naughty child or a dog you did not want. "Underfoot, sit here." Dad, Stephanie hissed in my ear, smiling for the onlookers. "Just smile and nod. If you try to speak to anyone, if you try to ask for food, I will put you back in that basement so fast, your head will spin." I sat down, hunching my shoulders, wrapping my arms around myself. I watched them mingle, I watched them laugh. I watched them spend money. They did not have celebrating a victory, they had not won. They looked at me not as a person, but as a prop in their stage play of success. The senile father, the burden. The reason they needed sympathy and support. Time passed in a blur of champagne corks and hollow laughter. I became invisible, a piece of furniture in the corner. Guests would glance at me, then look away, uncomfortable, or whisper behind their hands. I caught snippets of conversation. Poor thing. Mind is gone, totally dependent on them. Stephanie is an angel. But the centerpiece of the evening was Brian. He was holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by a group of men in expensive suits, yet men who looked like sharks in human skin. Brian was refilling their glasses, laughing too loud, gesturing wildly. He was high on adrenaline and scotch, feeling invincible. "You really pulled it off, Davis," one of the men asked, clapping Brian on the back. "We heard you were in a tight spot financially. How did you turn it around so fast?" Brian grinned, leaning in as if sharing a state secret. "It is all about closing the deal, boys. You have to know when to strike. I just acquired a major asset, a portfolio worth millions." Really, the man looked impressed. "Real estate." "You could say that," Brian laughed, glancing over at me in the corner, his eyes filled with mockery. "Prime waterfront property and liquid assets. The seller was a tough nut to crack, very attached to the past, but I convinced him. It is amazing what a little persuasion and the right paperwork can do." He raised his glass, gesturing toward me openly now. The men turned to look at the old man in the dirty flannel shirt. "Wait," another man asked, lowering his voice. "Is that the seller?" Brian nodded, taking a long swig of his drink. "Lock, stock, and barrel signed it all over this afternoon, power of attorney. The deed, the works. He does not even know what day it is. He thinks he is just here for the turkey. But tomorrow we liquidate. And the best part, he is going to thank us for it. We are putting him in a home, a nice quiet place where he can't hurt himself or our bank account anymore." The men laughed, a cruel sound that grated on my ears like sandpaper. To them, I was just a conquest. Deal closed, a sucker taken for a ride. They clinked their glasses, toasting Brian's ruthlessness. "You are a cold bastard, Brian," one of them said, chuckling. "But you get results, I will give you that. I watched them." My heart beating slow and steady. I memorized their faces, and I memorized Brian's boast. The arrogance, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. He was standing in my house drinking my liquor, bragging about stealing my life while I sat 10 feet away. I reached into my pocket, my hand closing around the cool metal of the satellite phone. I did not take it out, I just held it. A talisman of the truth. Brian thought he was the king of the jungle. He thought he had eaten the lion. He had no idea that the lion was just waiting for the right moment to open his mouth. The music swelled, the laughter grew louder, and Brian turned his back on me, dismissing me completely, dismissing the threat. He poured another drink, celebrating his genius, celebrating the end of his troubles. I looked at grandfather clock by the door. It was 8:59. The guests were happy, the hosts were triumphant. The trap was fully baited, and then the clock began to chime. 9 o'clock, right on cue. The heavy oak front doors swung open, not with a polite knock, but with a force that slammed them against the walls. The cold wind from the storm rushed in, extinguishing the candles nearest the door, sending a chill through the room that silenced the laughter. Instantly, Brian turned, annoyed, spilling his drink. "Who the hell is that?" he shouted, stepping forward, trying to assert his dominance over the intrusion. "You cannot just barge in here." But the figure standing in the doorway did not apologize. He stepped out of the swirling snow and into the light. A tall, imposing man in a black trench coat, flanked by 4 uniformed officers and the unmistakable figure of the sheriff. It wasn't a guest, it was the reckoning. And Brian's smile died on his lips as he realized the party was over. The silence in the room was absolute, a vacuum, where laughter had been just seconds before. The snow swirled in through the open doorway, dancing around the polished leather shoes of the intruders. Brian lowered his glass, his face a mask of drunken confusion that was quickly trying to reassemble itself into authority. He squinted at the man in the trench coat. "Hey," he shouted, stepping forward, swaying slightly. "Who do you think you are? You cannot just burst into a private residence. We are having a party here." The man in the coat ignored him completely. He stepped further into the room, his heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. Behind him, 4 men in dark suits moved with synchronized precision, flanking him like a Praetorian guard, and behind them, the sheriff, a man Brian knew. A man Brian had probably tried to bribe at some point. Stood with his hand resting on his belt. His face grim, Brian's eyes lit up with a sudden misguided recognition. He saw the suits, he saw the briefcase, he saw the authority, and his alcohol-soaked brain connected the wrong dots. "Wait a minute," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "You are the notary, right?" "The one Vinny said he might send over to certify the papers." "Ha. You really know how to make an entrance, pal." "I love it, very dramatic," he laughed. A wet, sloppy sound, and gestured grandly toward the group. "Come on in, boys. The bar is open. We were just talking about the deal. You are just in time to stamp the final paperwork." The old man signed everything. "It is all ready to go." He reached out to clap the man in the trench coat on the shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie from one shark to another. But his hand never made contact. One of the bodyguards moved so fast he was a blur, intercepting Brian's arm with a grip of steel, stopping him mid-motion. Brian yelped, pulling back, rubbing his wrist. "Hey, watch the merchandise. What is your problem?" The man in the trench coat stopped. He turned slowly to look at Brian, his eyes cold and dismissive, as if he were looking at a stain on a rug. "I am not a notary." "Mr. Davis," he said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying to every corner of the silent room, "and I am certainly not here to drink your liquor." "Then who the hell are you?" Brian demanded, his bluster returning, fueled by embarrassment and rage. "Get out of my house before I call the cops." The sheriff stepped forward, then his badge gleaming in the chandelier light. "I am right here. Brian, and I suggest you lower your voice. Mr. Blackwood is here on official business." "Blackwood," Brian repeated the name, his brow furrowing. "Blackwood. I know that name. You represent the bank, right? The one holding the mortgage on this place?" He laughed again, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Look, if this is about the missed payments. Relax, I have the money. It is coming tomorrow. The sale is done. The check is in the mail." "Literally, you guys are like vultures, seriously. Can't a guy celebrate his windfall without the suits crashing the party?" Blackwood did not answer. He did not even look at Brian anymore. He turned his back on him, dismissing him as irrelevant. He scanned the room, his eyes searching through the crowd of stunned guests, past the waiters, past the Christmas tree, until they landed on the dark corner where I sat. The room held its breath. The guests followed his gaze, turning their heads in unison to look at the dirty old man on the velvet stool. I sat up straighter, letting the blanket fall from my shoulders. I lifted my chin. Blackwood walked across the room, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. He unbuttoned his trench coat, revealing a tailored suit that cost more than Brian's car. He placed his briefcase on a side table and then, in front of everyone, in front of the people, who had pitied me, who had ignored me, who had laughed at me, he bowed. It wasn't a nod, it was a deep, respectful bow from the waist, the kind reserved for royalty or heads of state. Mr. Chairman Blackwood said, his voice clear and deferential. "The assets have been secured. Lions have been executed. The sheriff has been briefed, and the helicopter is waiting on the lawn. Everything is ready for your command." A gasp rippled through the room. Brian dropped his glass. It shattered on the floor, the sound of breaking crystal, the only noise in the stunned silence. Chairman Brian whispered, his face draining of color. "What, Chairman? Who are you talking to?" Blackwood straightened up and turned to face the room. He gestured to me, his hand open and inviting. "I am speaking to Mr. Harold King," he announced. "Founder and majority shareholder of King Logistics, owner of Omega Holdings, and as of this morning, the sole owner of this property and every debt you possess." I stood up. My knees did not crack, my back did not stoop. I shed the persona of the frail old man like a snake shedding its skin. I reached up and pulled off the cheap reading glasses, tossing them onto the floor next to Brian's broken glass. I looked at my daughter. I looked at my son-in-law, and for the first time in 24 hours, I let them see the truth. "Hello, children," I said, my voice strong and steady. "Did you enjoy the show?" The silence in the room was so profound, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the space, leaving a vacuum where only the truth could exist. I stood there next to the velvet stool that had been my designated corner of shame, and I began to change right before their eyes. It wasn't magic, it was simply the removal of a mask. I straightened my spine, the vertebrae popping as I shed the stooped posture of the defeated old man. I rolled my shoulders back, expanding my chest, filling the space with a presence that had once dominated boardrooms across 3 continents. I reached into the pocket of my flannel shirt and pulled out the cheap plastic reading glasses I had worn all day, the ones I had peered through with feigned confusion. While signing their fraudulent papers, I looked at them for a moment, letting the light catch the scratches on the lenses, then I dropped them onto the hardwood floor. The sound of the plastic cracking was small, but in that silence it sounded like a gunshot. I unbuttoned the cuffs of my dirty shirt and rolled up the sleeves, revealing the Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime on my wrist. The gold and platinum gleamed under the chandelier. A $6 million piece of engineering on the wrist of a man they thought was a pauper. The gasps from the crowd started then rippling outward from the people closest to me. Stephanie stared at the watch, her eyes widening in disbelief, recognition dawning slowly and painfully. She knew that watch. She had seen it in magazines. She knew what it represented. It represented a level of wealth she could not even comprehend, let alone steal. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What is going on? Who is this man? Why is he calling you?" "Chairman." I did not answer her immediately. I walked past her, moving toward the center of the room where the band had been playing. I stepped up onto the small riser and took the microphone from the stunned lead singer. The feedback whined for a split second before I silenced it with a tap of my finger. "Testing," I said, my voice booming through the speakers, deep and resonant, devoid of the rasp, devoid of the weakness. "Can everyone hear me good? Because I am only going to say this once." I looked out at the sea of faces, the wealthy neighbors, the business associates, the people Brian had been trying to impress with my stolen money. They were mesmerized, phones raised, recording every second of the spectacle. "My name is Harold King," I announced, my gaze sweeping the room, locking eyes with the men who had laughed at me earlier. "For the past 40 years, I have been the CEO and majority shareholder of King Logistics, a company I built from nothing. I retired 5 years ago, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to live a quiet life. I wanted to know if my family loved me for who I was, or for what I could give them." I turned to look at Stephanie and Brian. They were standing together near the fireplace, looking like deer caught in the headlights of a freight train. "Tonight." I got my answer. I reached out and Blackwood placed the blue folder into my hand. I opened it and pulled out the document I had signed at the dinner table. The power of attorney, the deed to the cabin, the papers they had celebrated over just hours ago. I held them up for the room to see. My daughter and her husband spent months planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. I said, my voice cold and hard. "They stole from me. They forged my signature on credit card applications. They plotted to drug me tonight, to force me to sign these papers, giving them control over my life and my assets. They wanted to sell my home, the home I shared with their mother, Wolf's, to pay off their gambling debts." A murmur of shock went through the crowd. Stephanie let out a strangled cry, shaking her head. "No. That is not true. He is lying. He is confused." "I am not confused, Stephanie." I cut her off, my voice sharp as a razor. "And these papers, they are worthless." I ripped the documents in half, the sound tearing through the room. Then I ripped them again and again, letting the pieces fall to the floor like confetti. Do you know why? Because Harold King, the retiree, does not own anything. All of my assets, my properties, my accounts, my portfolio were transferred into a blind trust called Omega Holdings 5 years ago. I do not own the cabin, the trust does. And the trust requires 3 signatures for any transfer of assets, not just mine. So even if you had drugged me, even if you had forged my name, you would have gotten nothing, 0. Stephanie fell to her knees, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The months of planning the lies, the betrayal, it was all for nothing. She had sold her soul for a contract that was null and void before the ink was even dry. "But we are not done," I said, turning my attention to Brian. He was backing away slowly, trying to melt into the crowd, trying to find an exit. But the sheriff stepped into his path, blocking the way, his hand resting on his holster. Brian stopped, trapped, sweating profusely, his face a mask of terror. "You stood there tonight, Brian," I said, pointing a finger at him, accusing and unyielding. "You stood there drinking my scotch and bragging to your friends about how you tricked the old man. You said you liquidated me. You said I was a sucker. Well, Brian, let us talk about liquidation." Blackwood handed me the red file. I opened it, revealing the stack of promissory notes, the IOUs, the threatening letters from Vinny, the loan shark. You owe $212,000 to a man named Vincent Moretti. I read from the file. A man known for breaking legs when payments are late. You told my daughter it was bad market investments, but we both know it was online. Poker and sports betting. You gambled away your family's future. Brian's knees buckled. He grabbed the mantelpiece to hold himself up. How do you know that? Because I bought your debt, Brian, I said, closing the file with a snap. As of midnight last night, I am the sole holder of your promissory notes. I bought them for cash, fully legally transferable. Vincent was very happy to sell. He sends his regards, by the way. The crowd gasped again. People were whispering, pointing, looking at Brian with disgust. The successful real estate mogul. The man of the year was revealed to be a degenerate gambler drowning in debt, so Brian. I continued walking down from the riser, moving toward him like a shark closing in on a wounded seal. You do not owe the mob anymore, you owe me. And unlike the mob, I do not break legs, I break lives. I am calling the loan due immediately. Payable in full, right now. Do you have $212,000? Brian shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No, Hal, please, we do not have it. You know we do not have it. We are family. Family. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Family does not spit on their not. Father's coat when they think he isn't looking. Family does not lock their father in a basement on Christmas Eve. You are not family. Brian, you are a bad investment, and I am cutting my losses. I turned back to the crowd, raising my voice one last time. And finally, there is the matter of this house. Stephanie looked up from the floor, her mascara running down her cheeks, hope flickering in her eyes, faintly thinking maybe she still had a roof over her head. Even if she had lost everything else, this house, I said, looking around at the vaulted ceilings, the expensive art, the trappings of a wealth they did not earn, is currently in foreclosure. You missed your last 3 mortgage payments. You hid the notices from each other, but you could not hide them from the bank. Or from me. Blackwood handed me the final document, the deed I had signed at the hotel. This morning at 9 a.m., Omega Holdings purchased this property from the bank for the full outstanding balance plus fees. I held up the deed showing the official seal showing my signature at the bottom. This is not your house anymore, Stephanie. This is my house and you are trespassing. The room exploded into chaos. Guests began to scramble for their coats, wanting to distance themselves from the disaster. Stephanie let out a scream, a primal sound of pure devastation. She looked at the walls, she looked at the furniture, she looked at the life she had built on lies, and she saw it all dissolving into smoke. You cannot do this, she shrieked, crawling toward me, grabbing at the hem of my trousers. Daddy, please. This is our home. Where will we go? It is Christmas. You cannot kick us out on Christmas. I looked down at her, at the daughter who had planned to drug me, who had laughed about my death, and I felt nothing. The love I had held for her for 32 years had been burned away, leaving only ash. You kicked me out first. Stephanie, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of finality, you kicked me out of your heart years ago. You kicked me out of your life when you decided I was just a resource to be mined. And tonight you literally kicked me into the basement. I pulled my leg away from her grasp, stepping back. Sheriff, I said, turning to the officer, the property belongs to me. I would like these trespassers removed from the premises immediately. They have 5 minutes to gather their personal effects. Anything they leave behind will be donated to charity. The sheriff nodded, stepping forward, signaling to his deputies. All right, folks. Party is over. Let's clear the room, you heard the man. 5 minutes. Brian collapsed onto the floor beside Stephanie, weeping openly. A broken man, the guests were fleeing, rushing out the door into the snow, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Blackwood stood by my side, stoic and silent, his job done. I looked at the wreckage of my family. I looked at the sobbing couple on the floor. and I felt a strange sense of peace. It was over. The lies were over. The manipulation was over. I was alone, yes, but I was free. And for the first time in a long time, I was the one in control. I walked over to the fireplace and picked up the glass of expensive scotch Brian had left there. I raised it in a mock toast to the empty room, to the ruins of the party, to the end of an era. Merry Christmas, I whispered. Taking a sip, it burned going down, but it was the cleanest thing I had tasted all day. The sheriff moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a glacier. He stepped up to Brian, who was still slumped on the floor, weeping into his hands. The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut cut through Brian's sobs, silencing them instantly. Brian looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot, the realization of his new reality crashing down on him. He tried to scramble backward, but the deputies were on him in a second, hauling him to his feet. "Brian Davis," the sheriff said, his voice booming in the empty hall. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit financial fraud, attempted grand larceny, and the abuse of a vulnerable elderly person. We have the audio recordings from Mr. King's device corroborating the intent to drug and coerce him. Those tapes are already with the district attorney. I did not do it." Brian shrieked, struggling against the metal cuffs. "It was her. It was Stephanie. She bought the pills. She planned it all. I just went along with it. I am a victim here. I watched him throw his wife to the wolves without a second of hesitation. It was exactly what I expected from a rat trapped in a corner. He had no loyalty, no honor, just a desperate need to survive at any cost. Get him out of my sight," I said, turning away. The deputies dragged him toward the door, his heels skidding on the polished wood he had been so proud of just hours ago. He was screaming, begging, threatening, but nobody listened. He was just noise now, meaningless noise. Then there was Stephanie. She was still on her knees in the center of the room, the red silk of her gown pooling around her like spilled blood. She looked up at me, mascara streaking her face, her hands clasped together in a pose of prayer. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling, "please, you cannot let them take me. I am your daughter. I am your little girl. I made a mistake, okay? A terrible mistake, but I was desperate. Brian made me do it. I love you, Daddy. I have always loved you." She crawled toward me, reaching for my hand, trying to touch the hem of my coat. I stepped back, looking down at her with a detachment that surprised me. I searched my heart for a flicker of the love I had held for her for 32 years. I searched for the memory of the little girl with pigtails who used to wait for me by the door, but all I saw was the woman who had laughed about my potential death in a ditch. All I saw was the predator who had planned to poison her own father for a payout. "You do not love me, Stephanie," I said, my voice cold and final. "You love what I can give you. You love the lifestyle my money provided, but tonight the bank is closed permanently." "Daddy, please," she sobbed, grabbing at the air where I had been. "We have nowhere to go. It is a blizzard out there. We will freeze." I leaned down close to her face so she could see the absolute resolve in my eyes. "You hoped I would freeze to death on your porch. Stephanie, you laughed about it. You said it would save you the trouble of dealing with me. You were willing to let me turn into an ice sculpture to get what you wanted. Well, now you are going to get exactly what you wished for. You are going to experience the cold just like you wanted me to." I stood up and signaled to the remaining deputies. "Remove her," I ordered. "And Sheriff, she takes nothing. No coats, no boots, no jewelry, no purses. She leaves with exactly what she has on her back. The rest belongs to me to cover the debts she incurred in my name. No." Stephanie screamed as the deputies grabbed her arms, hauling her up. "No, you cannot do this. It is my house. It is my stuff. It is all mine," I corrected her, turning my back on her screams. "Get them out now." The deputies marched her toward the door. She fought them, kicking and screaming, her dignity gone, her mask shattered. They reached the heavy oak doors and threw them open. The wind howled, a vortex of snow and ice rushing into the warmth. The deputies pushed Brian and Stephanie out onto the porch into the biting cold, into the storm they had ignored while they drank my wine. I walked to the door and watched them stumble down the steps into the deep snow. Brian fell face first, cursing. Stephanie stood shivering violently, her arms wrapped around herself, the red dress offering no protection against the elements. They looked back at me, their faces twisted with hate and fear. I reached out and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the door. "Merry Christmas," I said. And then I slammed the door shut, locking out the cold, locking out the betrayal, locking out the past. I turned the deadbolt with a satisfying click. The silence that filled the house was heavy, but it was clean. It was the silence of a problem solved, of a tumor removed. I was alone in a mansion I had just bought, surrounded by the wreckage of a party I had destroyed. But for the first time in years, I felt warm. I turned away from the heavy oak door, leaving the screams of my daughter behind me, sealed in the storm. The house was quiet now, a mausoleum of greed, but there was still one heartbeat left in it that mattered. I walked up the grand staircase, my footsteps heavy on the plush runner, counting the steps to the second floor, the nursery. I pushed open the door to Lily's room. She was sitting on her bed, clutching a teddy bear, her big blue eyes wide with fear. She had heard the shouting. She had heard the chaos. But when she saw me, her face crumpled in relief. "Grandpa," she whispered, reaching out her small arms. I walked over and scooped her up, wrapping her in my suit jacket, burying her face in my shoulder so she would not see the ruin downstairs. "You are safe now, Button," I whispered, stroking her hair. "We are going on an adventure. Just you and me." I carried her down the stairs, past the overturned chairs and the spilled wine, past the sheriff, who tipped his hat in silent respect. Blackwood was waiting at the side entrance, holding the door open. The wind caught us as we stepped out, but this time a long, sleek black limousine was waiting, its engine purring, its interior glowing with warmth. The driver held the door open, and I climbed in, settling Lily onto the soft leather seat, wrapping a cashmere blanket around her. She was asleep before I even buckled her in, safe and warm. As the car began to move, gliding down the long driveway past the snowdrifts, I looked out the tinted window one last time. Through the swirling whiteout, I saw a flash of red. It was Stephanie. She was running after the car, stumbling in the deep snow, her arms flailing, screaming words. The wind tore away before they could reach me. She looked small, insignificant, a speck of rage against the indifferent power of nature. She fell to her knees, the snow swallowing her, the cold claiming her just as she had intended. For me, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt the heavy finality of a book closing. I reached out and pressed the button on the armrest. The privacy partition slid up, blocking the view, blocking the past, blocking the daughter I had lost. The screen went black, the car accelerated, heading toward the city, toward the airport, toward a new life where love was earned, not bought. I looked down at Lily, sleeping peacefully beside me, and for the first time in years, I knew exactly where I was going. Home. The bitter cold of that Christmas night taught me a lesson that no amount of money could buy. Family is defined by loyalty and love, not by blood or obligation. For years, I mistook my daughter's greed for need, enabling a toxicity that nearly destroyed me. We often fear being alone, but there is a solitude far worse than silence, the company of those who see you only as a resource to be consumed. Standing up for oneself isn't cruelty, it's survival. In the end, the only inheritance that truly matters is the integrity we leave behind and the innocent lives like Lily's that we choose to protect. If you believe I did the right thing by saving Lily and leaving the toxic past behind, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.